Alrighty, hello everyone. Um, Thank you so much for closing out Black History Month with us, and happy Leap Day to all those celebrating as well. I'm going to introduce your moderator in a second and all the logistics for the event, but I just wanted to note that my name is Gabe Friedman. I was until very recently an editor at the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. And I've just recently become director of editorial experiences for 70 Faces Media, which owns several brands, including JTA and My Jewish Learning, Hey Alma, the New York Jewish Week, more. And I just say that because I wanted to note that it's a priority for me and my whole team. We're excited for this event, of course, but we want to do more events with Jews of color on Jews of color well beyond Black History Month. So there's a lot more to come. And I hope you keep up with us. We have a new page that for the first time starting this week collects all of our offerings in one place. It's mygewishlearning.com/courses. I'll put that in the chat at some point. Yeah. So you're not crazy if you haven't seen it before. It's brand new. And we'll be updating it constantly with all of our new offerings. So we have an incredible turnout today for this incredible panel, which we're really excited about. I can't believe they're all here in one place. As someone who's been following them separately for a long time, it's a rare treat. So I hope everyone, realizes that from the get-go. The logistics of the whole thing, Professor Bruce Haynes, who I'll introduce in a moment, is going to moderate the discussion, and I'm going to let him introduce the rest of the panelists and the framework for the discussion. I just wanted to note that throughout, feel free to put questions in the chat box, and I'm going to sort through it, and we'll leave a few minutes, maybe 10 to 15 minutes at the end to go through as many as we can. And you will all get a recording of this video. All registrants who signed up through our form will get a recording, likely tomorrow. Okay, so Bruce D. Haynes is professor of sociology at the University of California at Davis, where he holds affiliation in Jewish studies, religious studies, geography, and community and human development. He's an expert on race inequality and the lives of Jews of African descent in America. His book, The Soul of Judaism, Jews of African Descent in America, is the winner of the 2019 Albert J. Raboteau Book Prize for Best Book in Africana Religions. And it's generally recognized as the definitive work on Black Jews in the United States in recent memory. He's also written for publications ranging from ESPN to The Forward, and he's appeared numerous times on PBS and NPR. And he also, I want to give a shout out to one of our panelists, Robin Washington, who documented this week in an article in The Forward how Professor Haynes recently discovered an interesting piece of his Jewish ancestry. So I'll put that article in the chat as well as we get going here. And yeah, I think I'll hand it off to you, Bruce, if that sounds good.
Thank you, Gabe, for that warm introduction. And thanks also to 70 Faces Media for organizing this really special event today for Black History Month. Good morning to you if you're on the West Coast, and good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. It's an early morning for me here in California, but I'm really honored and thrilled to be here. Before we begin, let me introduce our amazing panels. First, we have Isaiah Rothstein. Isaiah is a rabbinic scholar and public affairs advisor at the Jewish Federation of North America. He's also founder of the Federation's Initiative for Jewish Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, the Jewish Youth Climate Movement, and Komaka, a community for Black Orthodox Jews. Prior to working at the Federation, Isaiah was a rabbi in residence at Hazon, Isabella Friedman, and Bekolashon. And he served as rabbi for youth at the Carmel Academy, Young Israel of Stanford, NCSY, and Camp Yavneh. Raised in a multiracial Chabad family, he sees himself as a human bridge connecting disparate parts of the Jewish community and America. Next on our panel is Ilana Kaufman. Ilana is chief executive of the Jews of Color Initiative. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. Her work sits at the intersection of the Jewish community, racial equity, and social justice, and is anchored by the voices and experiences of Jews of color. As a guest on NPR's All Things Considered, as well as Code Switch, with pieces featured in E-Jewish Philanthropy and the Foundation Review, Ilana is extremely passionate. She's an educator, she's a philanthropist, and she is an advocate for the Jewish community, racial justice, and Jews of color. You can see she has quite a full plate. She is also a senior Schusterman Fellow who is always searching for Jewish texts for discussions about equity and social justice. We also have, I happen to say, a good friend of mine, Robin Washington. Robin is a journalist, editor, and producer. He grew up in a Chicago family of a Black and Jewish civil rights activists. Amongst Black and Jewish civil rights activists, he went on to chronicle the movement in his acclaimed PBS documentary, You Don't Have to Ride Jim Crow. Today, he's editor-at-large at The Forward, and he's also been on the editorial board member of the Boston Globe, as well as the Boston Herald as a columnist. His commentaries have appeared in newspapers around the world, and of course, he's been a frequent guest on NPR, BET, the BBC, MSNBC, CNN, and even Fox News. And to our next on our panel, to round it out, we have Yolanda Savage Narva. This is the first time Yolanda and I have had the pleasure of being on the same panel together, so I'm really looking forward to seeing her contribution to this awesome conversation. She is president of Racial Equity and Diversity and Inclusion and Communities of Belonging for the Union of Reform Judaism. Yolanda's recent speech at the March in Washington 60 about memory, imagination, and belonging is the foundation she has built her life works upon. For more than 20 years, Yolanda has collaborated with different tribal governments to strengthen public health systems, promote pedestrian safety, and advance health equity in states and territories. And she's known for coining the phrase, walking is a civil right. Most recently, Yolanda was the executive director with Operation Understanding DC, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting understanding, cooperation, and respect while fighting and eradicating racism, anti-Semitism, and all forms of discrimination. Quite a guest list we have today. So let me open by saying, this current moment is proving to be historically difficult for both Blacks and Jews. In the period following America's so-called racial reckoning, we have witnessed a major rise in anti-Semitic rhetoric and a significant spike in hate crimes against Jews in recent years. Racism occurred before this horrific attack on October 7th shocked the world. The war in Gaza has brought unprecedented visibility and often unwanted attention towards American Jews. And for Jews of African descent, many, and as well as Jews of color, many who have long been unable to avoid being conspicuous, this moment can carry some deep irony. So for our discussion today, on this final day of Black History Month, our panelists will tackle two main threads. First, while scholars and advocates debate over the exact number and how best to count Jews of color, all observers agree that the numbers of Jews of color in America are growing significantly. And this is particularly true amongst the younger generation of Jews in America. Second, who are Black Jews? And do they have distinctive perspectives on the Jewish experience in America or in Israel? And just who is a Jew of color? And how should Ashkenazi Jews, who have often been classified as white people, fit into today's conversations about social justice, racism, and diversity, equity, inclusion? And how have the events of October 7th change this conversation for Black Jews and Jews of color. So now let's turn to our panelists. I'll open with the first question that I'll toss to Robin. And Robin, I've heard some people, even yourself, say things like, to be Jewish and Black means to be 200%, meaning that people say they are 100% Black and 100% Jewish. What does being Black and Jewish mean to you? And how do you deal with the different parts of your Jewish and Black identities?
Well, thank you, Bruce, and thank you, everybody, in this magnificent room of thousands. What do we got here? So for me, it's never been a contradiction. For me, it's been my entire reality, and I don't know any other. But I would say, even that being the case, you still have to work at it. Maybe I work at it by constantly, and maybe it's endemic in who I am, educating the whole world. So I like to say, if I'm in a group of Jews who aren't Black, I bring up the Black issue. If I'm in a group of Black people who are not Jewish, I bring up a Jewish issue. And right now, I'm blessed to be with my sisters and brothers who are Black Jews. I'll bring up an issue they didn't think of. So it's constantly thinking of and being the other, but that's not a negative thing. It's called empathy. And actually, if we talked about nothing else in this entire forum, and we're talking about the whole world situation, and particularly Israel and Gaza and the whole fallout to everything, what is missing is empathy. I'm just going to leave it right there.
Thank you for that fantastic answer. Ilana, would you like to add?
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. It's great to be with all of the hundreds of people out there, like Robin said. You know, in some ways, and I both understand but also reject the idea that as a Black Jewish person, I need to be 200% of anything. I think for me, the work has been about moving through the world as an integrated human, where my Blackness and my Jewishness, my gender identity, all of my identities, just like each one of you have multiple identities, that I can be whole and move through the world in my full power. And so as a Black Jewish person, what that means is that I show up in my full self, that I can interact with each one of you and with everyone in the world in a way that represents and celebrates my Blackness, that represents and celebrates my Jewishness, and that what comes out of me, my intentions, my words, my actions, reflect my full embracing of my identity, my full pride as a Jewish person, my full pride as a Black person, and that I move through the world unafraid to be my whole self. And unafraid to be my whole self in Jewish communities, unafraid to be my whole self in Black communities, unafraid to be my whole self in the secular world, so that I can represent all of us as Jews, so that I can represent as appropriate, as I can represent all of us as people of color, and that I can represent myself and my family as a Black person in a way that's filled with pride, in a way that's filled with confidence, in a way that's filled with courage, in a way that represents and understands that we are a multiracial people. And so the idea that we have to be separate or just represent one side of ourselves or another side of ourselves, in fact, maybe makes us fall further apart rather than brings us together. Thank you for the beautiful question.
Wow, thank you for an amazing answer. I'm so happy this event is being recorded. Isaiah, please. You have a tough to follow that answer, but
yeah, no, I mean, hey, it is always a pleasure to be able to learn from my colleague Ilana Kaufman and to hear what she has to say. And yes, I mean, to what she just shared. And, I'll say the way I was raised, the question of what are we made up of as humans, growing up in Muncie, New York, I've heard this phrase, we are chelek Elokai mim'al. We are all from one source of something greater, or a source of the divine. And I really do think that just echoing what Ilana shared, the ideal would be that we could all be seeing ourselves as distinctly just human, and wholly human, holy and holy human. And so on the note of social and cultural identity and how that shows up in a Western society and American discourse, yes, there's definitely questions of I'm Jewish, or I'm Jewish and really that whole psychology that somehow this identity marker is a Jewish but but this is a Jewish and, right? So I feel like, we're still in the 2020s where it's not, unfortunately, it's still not normative, as Alana was pointing out, that we are a multiracial Jewish community. We're a global people. I think that for many, they view Black and Jewish, especially for those who don't identify as Black and Jewish. Oh, yeah, they're Black and Jewish, or like, oh, but by the way, they are Jewish, but they're also Black. And instead of it being something that's a fully integrated approach, and I also remember hearing this idea of I am layers and not fractions. So going back to the 200% or the 100%, or for me as a Black Jew with white skin, do I want to really divide my identity into percentages of where my ancestors are from? Like, no, I'm a layered human. All of those parts of who I am, like sort of that Shrek metaphor of an ogre has an onion has layers. So too, I have layers. I'm not only one thing. And I think that that's obviously doesn't name that there is a tremendous amount of harm that takes place when certain identity groups are seen as separate from what is Jewish. There's a lot of harm. And so for us to be able to continue to train ourselves to recognize the biases that we hold, where Black and Jewish shouldn't be seen as mutually exclusive or as fractions that are layered, that it's actually just, we are.
Thank you so much for that answer. I love how your two answers captured this dynamic cultural and religious dimensions of Jewishness and being Jewish, and how you all emphasize this humanness, being a complete human being, integrating your identities as being able to express yourself 100% all the time of who you are. Yolanda, please, how do you manage these tensions of identities in America and in your life?
It's an excellent question, and my panelists have really answered it beautifully. I just want to first say thanks so much for hosting this. Thanks for everyone who's making time to be here today. I think a lot about identity all the time, and there's a social identity, and then there's a self-identity, how we perceive ourselves. And I have always talked about myself as a citizen of the world. My identity is a Black Jewish woman from the South, and I want to be in spaces where that is fully and wholly embraced. And I don't have to leave any parts of myself at the door. And I think that everyone should feel comfortable with who they are and being able to do that in any setting that they're in. And I think when we really stop and think about how we're making spaces of belonging and open to everyone, that we really need to think about everyone having an opportunity to be seen through B'Tselem Elohim, which is the image of God. And when we think about people in that way, we're not distracted about whether or not people are identifying in one way or the other. We're accepting people for who they are, their full humanity. And that's how I navigate the world. And that's how I see others as well. And we've really got to focus on that as we move forward and we create these communities that are interracial, multiracial, and all of the identities that we bring. We should never have to leave any part of who we are at the door.
Well, let me follow that up, Yolanda, with another question. And I'm sure you are aware that there have been recent debates in universities and across institutions, organizations across America about the place of Jews in discussions of diversity, equity, and inclusion. What are your thoughts and your experiences about that?
That's a good follow-up question. I have honestly lost sleep over this debate around DEI and where we all fit into that. For me, DEI is about people. I think we've turned diversity, equity, and inclusion into this thing or this initiative, but it's really about people. It's about empowering people. It's about making sure that people have equal access to opportunities. And if we think about it, in the Jewish community, we are modeling what an inclusive conversation looks like, how we include people in all that we do. And DEI is really that umbrella framing for that. That means that every person, like I said, is seen through B'Tselem Elohim. They're a human being and they're coming with their own experiences and their own challenges. And if we are able to think about people in that way, then we're not excluding anyone. We're making things inclusive in a way that is powerful and looks at everyone as a full human. And so the debates are challenging because I think there are two pillars to it. I think there are people who are deliberately focusing on how to dismantle the system of DEI that has been created. It was created for a purpose. Back in the 1960s, it didn't just come out of thin air. It was really an opportunity to operationalize the things that have been put in place through the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And if we fast forward that to today, we need to do what we can to model what that looks like, to make sure that everyone is a part of that. And I think people who are pushing against that and creating this kind of misinformation and disinformation around DEI hasn't really thought about where they sit and how this impacts every single human being. And so many more conversations, I think, to be had about that. And I know my colleagues probably have some really interesting insights on it.
Would it be fair to characterize what you said as, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater with the idea of DEI, but that maybe DEI still needs some improvement?
Yes, 100%. And I think we're modeling that in the Jewish community, how to make sure that every person who is oppressed or discriminated against or feel marginalized, there's a space for them in the DEI movement.
Isaiah, I see you shaking your head a lot. Please jump in.
I'm just absorbing, taking it in, taking that breath. And yeah, just friends, as we continue to rumble and grapple with this topic, I think we need to remind ourselves to take those breaths, to slow down. And Yolanda, I'm with you on the sleep piece. And a few things that I'll share on this. One is when thinking about the difference between the values that we're mentioning here, justice and equity is what I would focus on, the DEI, but I'll get to the justice and equity versus what happens when values are turned into an industry, and then how maybe an industry could be any industry or system, how certain groups might be able to be left behind, as we've seen when it comes to the inclusion of anti-Semitism within DEI. But taking a step back, when I think of the values versus the industry, we're named as the Jewish people. We're named as people of the covenant, and when we were given that name in the times of Abraham, it was actually, as the verse teaches, if you'd like to look it up, it is Genesis 18, verse 19. Where it actually lays out why was Abraham chosen, because he was somebody who was able to lead la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat. He was somebody who was able to carry forward and advance tzedakah, which is a need-based approach to giving. It is not about what you believe someone needs. It's about what someone says that they need. Tzedakah keeps in mind the full person, the context in which they come into needing. And tzedakah is about a person-centered approach. It is about, and that is a system that we as a Jewish people hold very dearly. Tzedakah, also philanthropy for the love of humanity, is also a synonym for equity. It is very similar to the idea of supporting those who are most vulnerable, helping lift up, contextualizing the full needs of the individual and the history in which they come from. Equity is about not giving everyone the same shoe size. It's making sure that everyone has the shoe that they need so that they could walk in life without blisters and stumbling. Equity is about giving the prescription glasses that someone needs, not your prescription. That's equality. Giving what someone needs. That's tzedakah. It's a very deeply rooted. That was one of the reasons why Abraham was chosen to lead this covenant that the three major monotheistic faiths have held, that have brought the Magna Carta, that have brought the Ten Commandments, that have brought us to the Declaration, that have brought us to this American promise, right? This is la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat from the times of Abraham 4,000 years ago. And then mishpat, justice, systems, righting wrongs, making sure that policies, procedures, practices, the structures that we live in work for everyone. And when they don't, that we remedy that. And so those are deeply, deeply Jewish held values that go back thousands of years. But as it relates to how there might be somewhat of a DEI industrial complex where is this the framework, right? If again, we've seen the headlines where people are pulled in a lot of directions. Oh, should we not use the DEI framework? Should we use the DEI framework? Oh, like, well, it's fueling anti-Semitism. I would say 2 points on that. One is what Yolanda shared. The terms justice and equity, or the term DEI, or whatever you might acronym alphabet soup of identity politics you might use. These are terms that have been a lifeline for so many oppressed communities, not only since the 60s and ethnic studies and the civil rights, but since the times of Abraham. These have been key terms that to be able to remind us. And the people who need us, the people who deeply need us, the people who are being harmed every day, the people who are struggling because of social and cultural disparities, I don't know if they care what acronym we use. They want us to do the work. They want us to stay committed to the work. They want us to make sure we're righting wrongs. They want us to make sure that identity is no longer going to be something that's going to create a social disparity within communities. They want people to be reflected, represented. And so it's true, we have a lot to look at when it comes to this moment, the DEI industry, or I would even call it an industrial complex, but the values of justice and equity, and advancing those values and integrating them into everything that we do, that must be critical and a core component of how we move forward around this moment. So that's just a few thoughts on that. I know I'm curious what colleagues think.
Let me follow that up because, in the background, when we talk about Black Jews, when we talk about Jews of color, when we say, well, non-white Jews, lurking behind that conversation, for me, let's cut to the chase. Are we saying Jews are white? And so I want to, Alana, if you would address that question. Are Jews white? And who are Jews of color? And why has there been so much controversy surrounding this newfound visibility in the American Jewish context?
Okay. First of all, I just want to thank you, Yolanda, and thank you, Isaiah. And thank you for the pitch. So first, let me answer the second question by putting some framework around the first question. I both support and align with what Yolanda and Isaiah would say, but I would also say, we're talking about DEI as if it's some sort of inanimate object.
We lost your camera, by the way, Alana. Oh, perfect. Awesome.
We're talking about DEI as if it's some inanimate object that exists out here. And the question we need to be asking ourselves is what happened in the 1960s where Jews of Ashkenazi, white, European background separated themselves from the diversity of the multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic movement in the United States so that we were somehow not part of the building of ethnic studies as integrated inside of it. Where we was celebrating the outside of it by saying we want to fund ethnic studies departments. We want to support the civil rights movement, but the civil rights movement was also about us. And Jews came to this country as not white. And we then grafted onto a social structure where our families, my mother, her parents are from Poland and Romania, where we had the opportunity to choose a pathway of whiteness in contrast to the experience people of color were having in this country. And just like Italians, just like Armenians, just like Greek, there was a moment in this country where Jews of Ashkenazi background passively settled into a background that both protected us from anti-Semitism, because we could blend into the background, and also detached us from the movement of being marginalized in this country. And so, no, Jews did not come to this country as white. Jews of color have been in this country since the 1600s and 1700s. And we can look at that resource and those research. And Ashkenazi Jews came to this country not labeled as white. Somewhere between the 1930s, 1940s, the GI Bill, and then 2016 and Charlottesville, the arc of experience was that many Jews of Ashkenazi background were startled into a reminder that white supremacists and white nationalists want to kill Jews, want to kill people of color, want to kill queer people, and that's what integrates us. And so, no, Jews did not come to this country as white. And the United States offers a social construct that rewards people who can blend into whiteness. And then when you look around and look at the experiences of Black people and people of color in this country, there's incredible disincentive to cede white privilege. And so let me just offer that as a bridge between the DEI conversation and who are Jews of color. And who are Jews of color? Who are people of color? Who are white people? Race is a social construct, and we all know this. And racism and racializing racial categories is something that the US exceeds and excels at. And so in a context where people of color have been marginalized by social structures in this United States, in a context where people of color have been leveraged to advance the social and economic structures of the United States, we have also moved into a space of having an identity where our experience is different than those who have the experience of being white. And so for Jews of color, it is a term and it is a label that is both imperfect and helpful. It's just a way to organize ourselves, to have an identity, and to coalesce around a shared experience, to give ourselves shared language and shared strategies. And the experience of Black Jews and the experience of Asian Jews are not the same. Experience of Latinx Jews and the experience of maybe some Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews who may not identify as Latinx or are not the same. And so it's also a complicated, imperfect, useful, sometimes not, sometimes divisive term, but it gives us a sense of location, it gives us a sense of focus, and it gives us a way to advocate not only for equity, but as Rabbi Isaiah was talking about community and about supporting and nurturing and advancing the Jewish people. That's my answer for now.
Thank you so much. You know, behind the answer you gave, which was just a unbelievably sophisticated answer, I'm so happy you were able to explicate that so well, is this idea of assimilation, that American Jews aspired to, quote, assimilate. I'm old enough to remember the previous conversation about Jewish Americans was focused on the idea of assimilation, and the drive was to gain assimilation, which essentially meant acceptance as white. Today, it's almost as if we've forgotten that period. There is a great book I want to mention for those who are more scholarly on this topic called The Price of Whiteness, that I think is maybe one of the best pieces of literature that really delves into the question of Jews and race in America. And with that, Robin, I know you have much to say on this topic. You have written about this topic. Please, let's have you weigh in.
I want to go back to DEI for a moment and
Sure.
sort of recapitulate something Yolanda said and put more history on it. And Alana and Isaiah took us back to Isaiah, right? He took us to Abraham. But
by the way, there's a lot of good stuff on justice and equity also in the book of Isaiah. Just that, yeah, good point.
There we go. But thank you, Rabbi. But I want to actually, this is Black History Month, so I want to focus on, didn't I say I bring up the Black thing if it's a Jewish conversation or whatever? So I want to remind people that whatever you want to call it, and I'm researching right now to see when exactly the phrase diversity, equity, and inclusion came up, because we've been doing it for years without calling it that, called it all kinds of things. So going back to when the first Black person stepped foot on this soil, and liberation, was knew that she or he didn't want to be here, certainly doing the work that he or she was forced to do. There have been all kinds of sacrifices and events and horrific things that happen, and then promises made that have been broken since day one. So Revolutionary War, Blacks were promised, mostly by the British, by the colonials too, hey, fight with us and you get your freedom. Didn't really happen, did it? Okay, so Civil War, we get our freedom and we're promised 40 acres and a mule. Anybody see that happen? All right, Civil Rights Movement, we were promised things. First, equal opportunity was one catchphrase, and then the other one was affirmative action. What happened to those programs, right? DEI comes along. The backlash happens every time there's some promise made. Okay, this is nothing new. And so we have Jews, we can get into the whole, are we white, whatever, how do I identify? There's a crisis going on. It's great that Jews, white appearing Jews, are talking about it again since October 7th. They suddenly have it pushed back into their faces. And this whole thing, well, maybe DEI isn't for us, or why are we doing this? The campaign against DEI was already out there. Yolanda said this. All right. And so people are taking advantage of this crisis and of our own psychoses to capitalize off of it and say, oh, well, you're not part of DEI, you know? But these are people who were already driven to get rid of it. And they've been doing that since this country was started, before this country was started.
Yes, and I'd even add that I think in the DEI spaces, for instance, on my own campus, many of the DEI people, quite frankly, made the presumption that Jews are white and discrimination was not a problem, and saw the questions of Jewishness as a religious issue and sort of tabled it outside of conversations of justice and equity and discrimination in America. And we have, I think, a hard time sometimes making distinction between access to whiteness and the privilege that brought, and the ongoing anti-Semitism that seems to persist and has come back with a new ferocity that we are not accustomed to.
And so, I'm going to name some names here, by the way. Edward Bloom is one of the major funders against DEI, and he was already doing this before October 7th. And Stephen Miller is out there suing anybody who has a program that even begins to mention it. So, you know, it's we need to police our own as Jewish people.
Okay, so let me ask a more difficult question.
By the way, can you just say one thing, Bruce, before you go there?
Oh, please, Isaiah.
And anyone else who, I don't want to dominate on this, but on the question of Jews and whiteness, right? As someone who has the melanin that I have, as an undercover brother, as a Black Jew with white skin, I've had many conversations with European Jews about whiteness. I'm not white, I'm Jewish, expression, this whole topic. And then let alone how colorism plays out, right? How I walk down the street versus how my brother walks down the street, and all of that. The book you mentioned, The Price of Whiteness, it is a dense read, but I really do recommend it for anyone on the call. I don't think you will, if you get through it, because again, it's a dense read, I don't think you'll have the same perspective. I don't think you'll be thinking this expression, I'm not white, I'm Jewish, the same way. And then there was something in the chat of, are Jews a religion? Are Jews an ethnicity? Are Jews a race? The book goes through all of this and how basically the Jewish community negotiated from decade to decade, trying to decide, are we a race? Are we an ethnicity? Are we a religion? And really, the answer is we're multiracial, we're multi-ethnic. And on some level, we're multi-faith. We know that 70% of people who got married in the last 10 years married somebody from a different faith group. But the book really just captures, I think, something that many of us are struggling with across Jewish life, or how to communicate how racial identity functions. And the book does lay out how there's a conditional whiteness. You mentioned, Bruce, something about assimilating towards whiteness. Dr. Goldstein in his book, he mentions acculturating to whiteness, adapting, because we need to adapt to our host society. How else did the Jewish people survive in every single host society? Okay, so we need to adapt again. But I just think it's required reading, especially in these years we're living in that are so racialized, where American Jews, European Jews are struggling. Many are struggling to sit in their own racial identity. So I hope people will take a look at that book.
Isaiah, you bring up, I think, a really important question that many Americans, I think, fail to consider. That's the distinction between racism and colorism. Could you, Robin, would you want to comment on that?
Racism and colorism?
Yeah, or would anybody care to comment on? As you say, if you're walking down the street, people judge you by color. And color is a signifier of race, but not a determinant of race in many fundamental ways. And so this notion of how color shapes how people are seen in the public, sort of the either hypervisibility or invisibility, say, of being a person of color.
Well, I'll just go back to whiteness and say I am ambiguous enough that there are people who look at me, immediately say black. There's people look at me and say, and they're not sure about it. Something is what I basically think they think. He's something. But the one thing is very clear, he ain't white. And by the way, anybody who's the least bit familiar with names knows that Washington is the blackest name in America. So there was no question, or if there was a question, when you saw me, there shouldn't be too much question once you see my name. But this goes into, we can go down a rabbit hole about this, colorism amongst people of color, right? Amongst black people and everything. And, I got stories galore about that. I actually don't think that's the main issue today. I think that somebody mentioned the whole point, the whole, thesis of race being a social construct. Whiteness can be bestowed upon you and taken away from you. I am most fascinated, bear with me on this one, because if you don't understand race, this will tell you more than anything else, with the story of Don Francisco, the longtime host of Sábado Gigante on Univision, right? And his family was from, his real name is Mario Kreuzenberg, okay? His family were German Jews. So in 1910 or so, they were white. And then in 1938, they weren't white anymore. They immigrated to Chile. That's where he was born. He was born in Chile. Now they're white again. Then he learned TV and he went to, got on Univision, and they came to Miami. Guess what? He's not white anymore. Race depends on where you are and when you are, and nothing illustrates it more beautifully than that. It can be bestowed upon you. It can be taken away from you. And so, how do we deal with that? As Jewish people, there's a discussion group going on Facebook. It's pretty huge. I'm not going to name the group, but very much concerned since October 7th. And it's mostly white appearing Jews, if you want to call them that. Somebody asked the question, are Jews white? Are white appearing Jews white? Are Jews of European descent who don't have African descent white? And the most beautiful answer I saw was, I am police white, but I'm not country club white.
Maybe that is a perfect place to end our conversation and turn it over to Gabe and see where our audience is and if we have any questions from the audience, unless someone else has some final comments. Alana.
I do want to take a bite at the colorism thing, because I think it's really important for us to take responsibility for how colorism and racism intersect. And as a person who has light skin privilege, and if you look around the Jewish communal ecosystem at the Black Jewish leaders and the leaders of color in positions of senior and executive leadership, there's some sort of thing we should be tracking on about kind of the relationship between light skin privilege and proximity to power, and proximity to influence, and proximity to resources, and proximity to decision-making authority. And we have to analyze why it is that somebody who looks like me, or somebody, Rabbi Isaiah, because you put it out there, you're in my upper left this morning, somebody who looks like Rabbi Isaiah, why it is that we've had the privilege of accessing fine opportunities for Jewish communal leadership. And we should interrogate that. And we need to interrogate why we're grafting on to leadership and to the opportunity to help advance the Jewish people, comfort to whiteness, and comfort to proximity with whiteness. And so it's everything to do with the intersection of racism and colorism. And people like me, we have to put it out there and we have to own it, because it's part of how we're navigating this conversation. And we have to name the importance of the role that colorism plays, and we have to resist it.
Thank you for that bit of self-reflection, Alana. Yolanda.
One thing, and I know we need to go, I just want to say amen to that. And it's embedded in everything. The colorism piece, how it connects to racism. If you look at language and you look at the use of Black or darkness, it is used in a way that makes people think that anything that has closer proximity to darkness or Blackness is evil or bad, and anything that has proximity to whiteness is good and pure. And so we really have to break this down and unpack this, because it's embedded into everything that we do, just like racism is, just like systemic oppression, institutionalized oppression. It's all part of one system. And we really have to find out how we can have the conversations around the colorism piece, because that's going to help us connect deeper to how racism is impacting our community.
Thank you for that, Yolanda. Gabe, are you there?
I am here. I will temporarily spotlight myself here. Thank you so much for that conversation. That I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else here did as well. A lot of positivity in the chat, not as many formulated questions, but I'll get to some specific questions. But I wanted to kind of like capture some of that and ask you all. There was desire for some people to hear about more spaces in which white presenting Jews can maybe interact with Jews of color or learn more beyond this conversation. So I don't know, maybe it'd be good to hear from you all if you have specific projects. I know Alana, you responded with 1 million, I think, in the chat. So I'm curious to hear what positive coming together sort of projects you all have going on or that you know of and want to promote. And why don't we start with Isaiah, because I feel like you know a lot of goings on in the community.
I mean, to the question of how people can engage more with Jews of color. I mean, the long-term answer that hopefully doesn't take that long is that we want to make sure that our communities are reflective of the social and cultural diversity of American Jewish life. So if our institutions don't reflect that diversity, that might be why you haven't spent much time with Jews of color. There's also a question of belonging from those who do show up to Jewish spaces. We know that the Pew said from those who attended synagogue, about 51% say they feel little to no sense of belonging. So you might be able to have somebody come into your space, but whether you're retaining that person and whether your environment is conducive, these are big questions. And it's why there are affinity spaces for Jewish people of color, because often the spaces in which we would like to be in a celebratory, multiracial space is not often conducive, where people are experiencing microaggressions and different sort of statements that make people feel like they want to leave. And if people are walking into our institutions and leaving worse, then maybe there's a question about institutions. With all that said, yeah, there actually, thank God, there's been a tremendous amount of growth within the JOC ecosystem. And I look at my colleagues on the call who can also share more about this. So I think that they're, from the list that we have, I don't know, I think there's at least 50 plus initiatives across North America right now that are focused on supporting Jews of color and for and led. And the question of how those initiatives integrate into a multiracial setting and how leaders can learn from and with Jewish people of color, I think that there are initiatives and opportunities like that. But if you're wondering how you can engage more deeply, I would start with the former question of like, how do we get our structures and our systems, the former statement I made, how do we get our structures and our systems to that place? In your demographic study in your local city, do you even have questions around racial and ethnic identity markers, or do you even know, like, or are you currently, if you're a decision maker or a policymaker, are you in relationship with people who live in your local city? But again, I think that there's a lot to say about continuing conversations like this. And also, yes, how do we hold affinity spaces together, but then also think through what it means to build a multiracial community space.
Thank you for that. Does anyone else have any specific
I might want to weigh
spaces
in
they
on
want to-
this, ironically. Just a little experience from my own experience at the university. We have done a study at UC Davis on the Jewish students, a survey of the Jewish students. And they're very surprised to find that 17% of the Jewish students self-identified as non-white at UC Davis. And so for me, I think about the future and young people and that changing demographic that's taking place. So I think one place that could make some interesting connections on college campuses is the Hillels in reaching out to their non-white Jews who are often not present in the Hillel.
If I can piggyback on that, one of the questions or comments I just saw flashing by in the chat was, can we get Jewish institutions beyond the 101 level of, guess what, they're Black Jews, right? We have an article today that we picked up from the JTA in the forward that says what you don't say to Black Jews. Very cute, but it says something about 1% of the Jewish population is Black. Alana, I thought it was more than that. I don't know where 1% comes from. And quite seriously, I would have liked to have seen that and questioned that article before we put it out there. That's just not right. The numbers that Bruce has are real. Alana, again, you got the numbers out there, but no one should be walking around saying, oh, guess what? There's Black Jews. If at this point we're still there, we got a lot of work to do. I do thank everybody on this call because you already know the answer to that. Of course there are. Let's get beyond the 101.
And also thank you, Isaiah, for putting that doc. Just real quick, there are a lot of questions about all the books and things mentioned in here. We will send a follow-up with the recording of this whole chat, and I'll make sure to collect as many book recommendations and Isaiah's great chart sheet that he just sent around, and we'll send that along with the video to everything. I just wanted to.
Yeah, I would just like to add, and I know Alana knows a lot about this topic, depending on which geographic regions you are sampling in, you have larger numbers of Jews of color. So when you go to major cities across America, Chicago or New York or the Bay Area, your numbers actually go fairly high relative to those national surveys. And I think people really need to pay attention to those geographical differences.
So, all right, I have an interesting specific question that I've been a little interested in myself. Someone asked about the Black Hebrew Israelites. And I would say that there's a lot of good reporting and explanation, a lot of articles on them on jta.org. I'll give that a little plug. But I'm wondering if anyone wants to give a quick little primer. I know there's a lot of, before the stuff dominating the news now, there was some stories that brought them into the news. Does anyone know a little bit about them? And I'm Professor Haynes, I'm sure you do, and can contextualize them a bit in terms of the Jews of color conversation?
Well, Robin has interviewed me on this topic in the forward.
We have the definitive answer is a piece with Bruce and Walter Isaac about this in the forward. Just search for Bruce's name, my name, Hebrew Israelites, and please do not use the term Black Hebrew Israelites, okay? None of the groups call themselves that, so you don't call people by names they don't use. Secondly, it's not true. Some of them are not Black. What a concept. Third, I could go on, but let's begin with that. I'm very proud to say the forward in our style no longer uses that term, and we prefer to use, our preference is the term each group calls themselves. There are many, many, many different types of Israelite groups, and some, their practices are very different. You cannot lump them all together.
Including Messianic groups as well.
And non-Messianic group. And those, this is also very important. You can be more than one thing. Didn't Alana just tell you that a little while ago, right? There are people who are Israelite who also go to an Orthodox shul. I'm not making this up, okay? So just like, look at all your families, look at everything, and look at the piece we have about Bruce today, because it's fascinating, because it tells you that if you thought your family was one thing, his DNA and historical records coming to the fore and your own family folklore are going to give you a broader view of what you thought.
Gabe, can I take a tiny bite out of the demographic question just very quickly?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so I'm going to respond to this as if I'm putting up Post-it notes in a non-hierarchical and unfinished and informal way in about 30 seconds. For those of you who are referencing our colleagues at Pew who have been partnered with us at the JOCI, if you look at their restatement of Jewish Americans in 2020, there is some discussion about Jews of color. And if you read into the notes, you'll notice that they actually never asked the respondents about their racial identity. And so Pew's data is really helpful And it models that those in the Jewish community under ages 25, I believe, they model at about 17% of the community are Jews of color. But if you look into the data, one of the most profound pieces of information we have is that, as Isaiah has talked about, we haven't really asked in a rigorous and disciplined way. If you look at our data, we did a meta study of the Federation's data and other data sources, and the number is something between 15 and 20%. Imperfect, but helpful. The Jews of Color Initiative is in the process of modeling another demographic study as we speak, and Dr. Haynes is on our advisory board. So what I want to say is I'm happy to be, Gabe, I defer to you. I can send you some resources. The data is imperfect, but getting better. But what we need to know is something like 20% of the U.S. Jewish community are people of color, and that number gets bigger every day. It is not going to get smaller. Like folks have talked about on the coast, that number can be up to 25% of families who identify as Jewish, identify as multiracial. So they move through the world with a lens of having people of color in our families, and these numbers get bigger every day. And so if we're not seeing Jews of color in synagogue, if we're not seeing Jews of color represented, it's not because we're not here. It means that there's a lack of alignment between affiliation and demography. I'll leave it at that, but thank you for letting me take a tiny bite out.
And it's important to understand how we define the Jewish community has a huge impact on the numbers of Jews of color that one comes up with. And so those very definitions, the more expansive the definition, the larger the numbers of Jews of color you end up with.
And Alana, I was just curious, like, when it comes to breakdowns by racial identity, like, I thought the Pew did have a breakdown of like Black and African American, like, under the total, like 3 or 4%. And then once you go under the age of 30,
They do, but it's actually, if you read into the footnotes, it's based on modeling and not asking. Pew has never asked response, do you identify as a Jewish person of color? So yeah, they're modeling and giving us good facts, but you got to go into those footnotes.
Thank you.
So I think we do have to wrap up. Thank you for that. There are so many good questions that have come up in the last 10 minutes that I want to get to. I hope to, and there's so much appreciation for the panelists, well-deserved. I think it was fascinating discussion. Sorry, Professor Haynes, for using language there at the end that was not helpful. Clearly, I need to read Robin's article. But I really look at this as the start of a lot of programming that we want to do. So if you enjoyed this and want to learn more, obviously, like I said, I'm going to gather all the materials that we talked about in one email for you all, along with the recording, and send that out. But do subscribe to 70 Faces Media newsletters and follow our page at myjewishlearning.com/courses. Like I said, I hope to do a lot more of these and very soon. Thank you so much to all the panelists.
Gabe, thank you for organizing this. This has been really awesome.
I appreciate it. And yeah, let's do it again sometime. I'll let everyone go and appreciate your time, and thanks for everyone for tuning in. We had an amazing turnout, and see you all soon.
Thank you so much.
Be well, everyone. Thank
you,
you.
colleagues.
Early Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Thank you.
See you.
Oh, Isaiah.
Thank you all.
I know we need it. We need it.
Oh.
You only get to say that because you're on the East Coast.
I'm getting closer. I'm a little closer, but we're all getting closer. Yeah.
So true. All right. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Gabe, thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
again.
Really.
Much love.